Okay, there are dozens, probably hundreds of different ways to make sourdough, and this is my way. So to make sourdough, I use my sourdough starter, which is right here. It's been kind of bubbling away for about 12 hours. The black line was where it started, and as you can see, it's risen probably trebled in size or so. So that's ready to go right now. I use bread flour, which has a high protein content, so it will create a lot of gluten. Semolina for dusting the top of the loaf, and rye for partially feeding my starter. Then we need water and salt, measuring cups, which is a habit of mine. Many people do it by weight, I do it by measuring cups. And last but definitely not least, a Dutch oven, actually also a banneton. And here is one I've made earlier, to show you just how high that's risen. It's pretty enormous. So I'm going to try and repeat this today. And the very first thing I need to do is to divide my starter into the portion that I'm going to use to make my bread and the portion I'm going to feed and put back in this jar. So I'll do that first. You'll also need a baker's lamb to make slashes and cuts in the top for your dough before you bake the dough. The reason we make slashes or cuts in the top of the dough is to prevent it from oven springing in unexpected directions. You see, if you stick dough in the oven and you don't have any slashes or cuts on top, it's likely to break open in a random kind of a way while it's cooking. Your slashes and cuts will make sure that the dough rises and breaks out of its glutinous shell in a way that you expect. So this one is a curved blade, and it's very thin and flexible. This is for making curved cuts in the top of your bread. It's very useful. There's its protective top. This one is a straight cut. This is great for making decorative cuts if you want to make very small cuts, like a corn ear or whatever. You'll need a straight one. I would recommend getting both in a double pack if you can. I think these cost me less than £10 online, so well worth an investment. A baker's lamb. So here's my starter again. I have half a cup of water in this Pyrex jug now, and I'm going to stir down my starter to get rid of the air bubbles, and then I'm going to pour half a cup of it into my water and mix that up. So I'll do that now. Here's my generous half cup of starter there, all stirred down. So the air bubbles are gone, but the yeast is still very active. Don't be fooled. Anyway, it makes it easier to portion things out if you don't have any scales, any kitchen scales. Because what you don't want to do is take half a cup of bubbly starter, because it won't weigh the same amount as half a cup of non-bubbly starter. So I'm going to add this to the water right now. And here we go. We're just going to mix this up into the water. This is the portion we're going to actually feed to keep our starter going for tomorrow or next week or whenever we want to make bread again. So now with the starter all mixed into the water, we're ready to feed it. And I'm going to do that with one scant half cup of all-purpose flour and one scant half cup of wholemeal rye. It really likes rye. My starter loves rye. I think most starters probably love rye. It's kind of a superfood for starters. So if you have any rye flour, and here I'm using this Dove's Farm rye flour. If you have any rye flour, just try it in your starter and you might be really surprised by the results you get. Mine grows extremely large when I add rye, so that's why I do it. Anyway, I'm going to mix this up. So now the starter is fed. I'm going to set it aside just for a minute while I use the container it was in with the remains of the starter to start baking the bread. Here I've added 1.5 cups of warm water to my starter in the starter jar, because it's really nice and tall and it makes a good place to mix water and starter before I add flour. Okay, so I've transferred the starter water mixture into a big bowl, and now I'm going to add 2 cups of bread flour. Bread flour is really high in protein, so it will produce much more gluten, which is good when you're making sourdough. I'm going to mix this up, and then I'm going to leave it for about 45 minutes to an hour to allow the gluten to start to develop. You'll also hear that called the autolyse stage. Here's what it looks like when you mix the starter water mixture with 2 cups of bread flour. It's a bit of a mess. It's very loose. Not much gluten happening there yet. As you can see, everything's falling apart. That will change though over the course of the next hour or so. So I'm going to cover this with a towel. I'm going to leave it alone for about 45 minutes to an hour. Meanwhile, we are going to transfer this fed starter mixture back into the starter pot that I have nicely washed up. There we go. It's all mixed up in the bottom of the pot. Once that settles down, it'll probably settle down right back to the black line on the side, and then it will begin to puff up again. I'm going to put this in the fridge because I'm not going to bake sourdough again until probably about a week from now, and that will be absolutely fine in the fridge. Don't do anything with it. We've left this alone for an hour, and now its qualities have completely changed. Look at that gluten forming. It's really, you can lift the dough up and you can see that it is sticking together. It's just changed quality. It's not quite such a rough looking mess now. It's way more gloopy, and that's exactly what we want to happen. So the first thing I'm going to do is just to pour the salt in. Pop, that's a tablespoon of salt, and then I'm going to put 2 further cups of flour in. I'm also going to add about another 1/4 cup of water to the dough to produce a really high hydration dough. The higher the hydration of the dough, so the higher the water flour percentage is, the wetter the dough, the more of an open crumb that you'll get in the end. It'll be a sloppier dough and more difficult to work with, but the end results will be worth it. So we're going to make a super sloppy dough, and I'm going to transfer this over to the mixer now for about 5 minutes. You don't need a mixer to do this. You can mix by hand. You're going to be doing a lot of folding as well, so you don't need a mixer, but I'm going to put it in the mixer just because I have other things to do for about 5 minutes with the dough cook. Okay, so now we're ready to move the dough from the mixing bowl into the bowl in which we will strengthen it, which is this bowl right here. And as you can see, it's really a shaggy dough. There's no window paning particularly going on yet. It's breaking pretty easily. It's very, very wet, which is what we want. And so to handle wet dough, the easiest thing to do if you don't have a dough scraper is to wet your hands. So dry hands, I'm going to wet them right now. And wet hands will allow you to handle the dough without as much of it coming off on your fingers. So I'm just going to use my hands to get this dough out of the bowl. There we go. That's most of it. Now see what kind of a, it's very gloopy. It's going to get gloopier too. I'm going to put this over here into our lightly oiled bowl and just kind of get any remaining dough out. Set this aside, move this over just a touch, and then we're going to do our first round of strengthening. So literally what you want to do there, and again I'll wet my hands once more, is take a little bit of dough from the side and fold it over to the other side, move around, repeat the process here, and you're just basically trying to create gluten and make it ever so stretchy so that the dough will trap pockets of air. Those will be the bubbles in your open crumb. We're just going to continue around like this. There we are. Until you kind of feel like the dough hasn't got any more to give it. At some point it'll start resisting. The surface tension will become very high, and it'll start kind of saying no. And at that point, that's when you want to leave it. And you want to leave that then for about 20 to 30 minutes at room temperature. If you're sticking your dough in the fridge and you're kind of building flavour, you can do that at this stage. You can really do that at any stage. Then you'll want to leave it longer than 20 to 30 minutes. But at room temperature or warmer, and in my case that's going to be on top of the water heater in the cupboard under the stairs, we'll just leave that for 20 to 30 minutes. So there we are. First round of stretches done. Well-oiled sheet of cling film on top, and this really must be well-oiled, otherwise it will stick. Which is especially bad during the later stages of sourdough baking, where you don't want to destroy your dough. You definitely don't want it to stick to your dough. So you definitely want to oil your cling film very well. Anyway, that is now going to go into the cupboard under the stairs on top of the water heater at about, I don't know, probably 25 centigrade or so. And we'll come back to it in about 30 minutes. Okay, it's been 20 minutes or so, and we've got our dough right here. I'm going to wet my hands again, take this cling film off. I'm just going to do a little bit of folding the dough, pulling it as far as it'll go and wrapping it, and turn the bowl, pull it and wrap it, pull it and wrap it, and again. As you can see, that the quality of the dough is changing, and the more we do this, the more the dough will become manageable or at least somewhat more manageable. It's beginning to protest, so I'm going to stop in a minute. Okay, put that back where it came from for another 30 minutes, then we'll repeat. See some big air bubbles forming in there already, which I'm kind of squishing out a little bit. I'm going to leave that alone now to ferment, to bulk ferment for about 3 hours or so. Okay, here is our bulk proof dough. As you can see, it has risen considerably. And take it out. Next stage is to shape it into a boule and put it in a banneton. So we're not going to use flour here, we're going to use water. So I'm just going to get a little bit of water and stick it on my pastry board so it's nice and wet. And then I'm just going to turn the dough out and hope it mostly comes out in one piece. There we go. If you have a scraper, you can definitely use that at this stage as well. That can be pretty good. So here's your dough, and we just want to shape it into a boule like this. A little bit like what we did before, really. We're trying to create surface tension on the outside of your boule using the gluten framework on the outside, and you're kind of teaching the dough where to kind of lay inside. It all seems very floppy and gloppy, but in the oven, this is how the boule will know how to kind of maintain its shape. You can let that rest for about 5 minutes and then do it again if you want to, just to create a little bit more surface tension. What you're trying not to do is to break it too much, because as soon as you do that, you're kind of undoing the surface tension that you've just created. You're kind of letting all the air out of the balloon. I have pre-shaped it in the bowl, so I'm just going to take it now. Oh, come on. There we go. Stick it in the banneton. Ooh, need a little bit more water on my fingers. Okay. And I'm just going to stitch it closed just a touch more. This is a really well floured banneton because the last thing you want is for your boule to stick to the sides of the banneton. That would be a bit tragic after all of this work that you've done so far. There we are, just closing it up, creating that surface tension. And hopefully that will tell the dough where to lie. And then we're going to cover it up with a very well oiled piece of cling film like this, because we don't want it to stick. I'm going to place it in a warm area to rise until it kind of fills the bowl around like this, and until it passes the poke test, which is where you poke it and it doesn't immediately boing back. So I'll show you that in a little while when we're ready. So we've had our dough in the banneton for quite some time and it has risen nicely. We're going to do the poke test now to see if it's ready. Yeah. So it's bouncing back, but not all the way and not instantly. That's pretty good. There we go. So what I'm going to do now is put it in the fridge for a couple of hours, which will slow down fermentation and rising, slow down the action of the yeast, and also firm up the dough a little bit to make it easier to score. If I don't do that and I want to score the dough, I'll have to tip it over and work super quickly. Otherwise it'll just spread out like a big puddle, and so cooling it down will help to avoid that scenario, and it means we can kind of get a little bit prettier with the cuts. So I'm going to do that right now. All right, we have come to the stage where we get to create a nice design. Now dough, here's the dough. It's been in the fridge. It's still very, very gloopy, so, but it's a little bit more easy to handle. I'm going to gently peel away the saran wrap or cling film that you've got on top. As you can see, any hint of no oil and it will cling to this dough, and that's definitely not what you want. So make sure that your cling film is well buttered or well oiled. So this is a piece of parchment paper which I have buttered. You can use grease-proof paper, parchment paper, whatever. Just make sure it's really well greased, because if it's not, once again, you'll have a problem with things sticking. I'm just going to give it a bit of a dust with some semolina. You can just gently touch it and brush it all over to make sure this doesn't stick, because with such a wet dough, the likelihood of it sticking it goes way up. So this is how you prevent it from totally losing its shape, when you, because the alternative is to just flop it right into your Dutch oven, but you risk deflating the dough. Anyway, here we go. There we are. Okay, so then we just even the flour out a little bit. This won't hold its shape for very long, so we want to make sure that we create a design in here as soon as we possibly can. Here's a knife. You can use a piece of dental floss, if I can find it, right here, or butcher's twine to create guide marks in your dough. We'll just go right here and here, like this. This is a pattern I found on YouTube the other day. I'm just going to do it like he did. So like this. And we're making an ear. Spin it around. Next one. We do the small cuts before we do the big cuts, because that allows them time to open up. If you do a big cut first, then you know the point of weakness is going to be that big cut. So if you're making a pattern with small cuts and big cuts, start with the small cuts. And now we're going to go like this and outline like this. I just want to make sure that all of our cuts are actually open. You can go over them again, that's no problem. It's important to do this quickly, but you also want to make sure that your design is actually properly cut. Okay, now this is going to be, it's going to look a little bit squished in our Dutch oven, but that'll be okay. There we go. Right, so got it in there. If I was sensible, I would use a smaller banneton, but currently I don't have one, so this is what you've got, and that's what it will look like before going in the oven. Whack your lid on, and now it'll go in the oven for 35 minutes at 230 degrees centigrade. That is the sound of the oven telling me that the first 35 minutes of baking are done. This is the most exciting part of baking sourdough, where you open the top of the lid and you see what you've produced, which could be great or it could be a disaster. So let's hope it's good. And I'm going to take this out of the oven. You can see along with me. There we go. Let's have a look. Okay, the moment of truth. We have a nicely risen boule. It's pretty gorgeous. It's going to go back in the oven now for another 13 or 14 minutes at a higher temperature, because what we want to do is we want to brown this area up here. These areas obviously will remain white because they are full of flour, but the rest of it needs to be browned up. So, but we don't put the lid on for this part. We just put it back in the oven with no lid, 13 to 14 minutes. And here we go. Here we have the boule, having been in the oven for 14 minutes to brown up. And there we go. Got a good oven spring, pretty big. Could have done with a smaller banneton so you can get the crumply sides, but really that should be a nice open crumb when it's cut, and that should make for some good eating. So, best of luck with your own sourdough. I have no doubt that you will rock it. So give it a go, and if at first you don't succeed, just try again.